So, right. From Nakhchivan, we are now moving farther north to western Azerbaijan, and more precisely to the archaeological site of Karacamirli in the Shemkir Rayonu. It is, let's zoom in, it is located about 20 kilometers east or northeast, actually, from the modern city of Shemkir, and only a little more than 10 kilometers away from the medieval citadel of Old Shemkir, which is located somewhere here. So the site is, as you can see, in the middle of the Kura Valley, not far away from the river itself, the original meandering riverbed, of which, however, is now covered by the Yenikent reservoir, which downstream is then followed by the larger Mingajevic reservoir. Karacamirli is, of course, much better known for its substantial remains of the Achaemenid period, which were then excavated by Florian Knaus in cooperation with Ilyas Babayev, and later on with Emil Iskenderov. The most noteworthy is certainly the main building on Gurban Tepe with the ground plan and architectural features, namely the limestone column bases that clearly show an Achaemenid presence at the site. This main residential building was surrounded then by nearby administrative buildings on small hillocks. And in 2013, a team from the University of Munich, led by Kai Kanyut, started an intensive pottery survey to investigate the areas in between and further around, complemented then by large-scale geophysical prospection, led by Jörg Fassbinder, and some excavations at promising spots. And one of them, now to come to Tepe 5, was this hill about 1 kilometer east of the main Mount Gurban Tepe. And I'm mentioning this because, to be honest, we thought it is just another administrative building of the Achaemenid period. Even after we had the magnetogram, we tried to compile these visible anomalies to build some kind of a structure. However, we were all completely wrong, fortunately, as I ended up to excavate a nice little cemetery. In total, we were able to locate and excavate 46 burials on Tepe 5 that can be attributed to 3 occupation phases. The first one, which is shown in the slide right now, consists of 20 burials spanning the period from the very beginning of the Late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, or in terms of absolute dates, from the latest 16th century to the 8th or 7th century BC. The second occupation phase was presented by only 7 burials datable to the late antique period. So in this case, they spanned the time from the mid-3rd to the end of the 4th century AD. And just to mention, the third occupation comprised of 14 medieval burials interred between 1280 and 1420, according also to radiocarbon datings of the skeletons, which were quite well preserved, as you can see in the slides. Today, I will, of course, focus only on the first occupation during the Late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. A few words to the characteristics of the burials. The deceased were all interred in simple pits dug into the ground, and most of them reached down into the coarse and quite hard virgin soil of the Tepe. So it is actually not a Tepe, it's just a natural hill. And then the grave pits were refilled with much softer earth. So after clearing topsoil and subsoil layers, it was rather easy to detect the outline of the grave pits and trace their side walls, even if they had quite complicated undercut sections or irregular shapes, which actually quite often was the case. At several instances, burials of the Late Bronze Age and early Iron Age were disturbed by later burials of the late antique period and medieval period. So they were interred very close by or intersecting those earlier burials, and these successive interments formed clusters of, let's say, merged pits with very irregular outlines, which we then call pit complexes. So the outlines of these larger pits that you see here also on the slide are not original, but the result of repeated interments at the same spot, but in completely different periods. Despite these later disturbances, in all of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods, at least some of the original inventory remained in situ. In most cases, also the skeletons, or these parts of the skeletons, which we then used as a source for radiocarbon dating. Now, on the slide on the left side, you can see the proposed sequence of the burials. It is here based on typological considerations, mainly on pottery, and then on radiocarbon dates, as well as in some instances on some stratigraphic observations, but they are of minor importance. It's just sometimes the grave pits were overlapping. The burials can roughly be divided into an early group hovering around 1500 BC, and a later group which covers the time span from about 1200 BC onwards. Only a single burial, namely the burial 6 here in this chart, can, on the basis of its pottery, tentatively be attributed to the time in between those two groups. As you can see in the slide, the early group was characterized by morphologically very similar pottery types. For example, this is nice spherical pots, or these spheroid bowls. We also have a nut-shaped bowl in one of the burials. They all had a black polished surface and sometimes this punctuate ornamentation, as you can see. Besides ceramic vessels, the deceased tend to be accompanied by some beads, mostly of just paste, white paste, but also some of bronze and carnelian, or also some shell beads. We've also found 2 obsidian arrowheads. One of them was found reused in a late antique burial, apparently an item that was found while they were digging up the older grave pit, and it apparently was considered suitable or nice enough to serve again as a burial gift for the new interment. In general, the pottery pointed to a date very late in the Middle Bronze Age or very early in the Late Bronze Age, respectively. This assumption was mainly supported by the Karacamirli kurgans 4 and 5, which were discovered in the 1980s, not very far away from Tepe 5, somewhere very close to the Kura river. So it's just some half a kilometer or a little bit more. And so far, I was not able to reconstruct the exact location of these kurgans. In a rather recent study, or it was, I think, 2011, Mina Vargusenova placed these 2 kurgans in a monography into the transitional phase between the Middle and Late Bronze Age, so around 1500 BC. And some of the vessels from this, here it is, from the vessels of this earlier group in Tepe 5, in particular of burial 2, which is shown here in the middle. They were virtually identical to examples from these kurgans, and as also already pointed out by Gusenova, very similar vessels in terms of shape, wear, and decoration are also well known from Armenia. A good example is here shown on the right side, the Hari tomb 41, which was dated to the very beginning of the Late Bronze Age. This example also highlights the permeability of the Lesser Caucasus at this time. Now, to reinforce these typological considerations, we took some radiocarbon samples of this earlier group, in 2 cases from the bones, and in 1 case, namely burial 2, unfortunately, because we had to use a charcoal from the fill because no skeletal remains were present in the grave. Nevertheless, the results were quite coherent and showed that the typological dating was pointing to the right direction. So there indeed can be dated around 1500 BC. The later group belongs to the early Iron Age and is represented by 3 radiocarbon-dated burials and at least 7 more burials that can be assigned to this period on the basis of typological observations. The pottery is characterized by the typical burnished gray ware, most prominent are perhaps the carinated bolts, at least for the later part, with sometimes elaborate burnished decoration. We had only one burial with a larger number of bronze objects. However, it was massively disturbed by two later interments, and of the skeleton, only the teeth crowns were preserved. So not very much. The deceased was adorned with various bronze objects that you can see on the photographs, including a headband and these two ornamented discs, which were worn on both sides of the head, quite characteristic for this period and region. The considerably long margins here proposed for each of the burials is due to the difficulties to tie in the finds from Tepe 5 into the various existing systems of periodizations of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in Western Azerbaijan, which regularly led to ambiguous results. As you probably all know, the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in Azerbaijan is subsumed under the designation Khojaly-Tepe Tepe, or in an earlier version also Genche Karabakh. Still puzzling is the internal chronological subdivision of this entire period. That means in this case from the onset of the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, or let's say more precisely, until the Achaemenids appeared in the region and caused a major change in the material culture in the mid-5th century. There had been various attempts to establish a chronological framework of these periods in question. The first one was conducted by Minkevich Mustafayeva in the 1960s, chiefly on the basis of metal object, and she divided the Khojaly-Tepe culture into three chronological stages, and in addition she also divided some main regional groups along the foothills of the Lesser Caucasus and the Kura Valley. In 1989, and then again in 2011, actually, Guzenova proposed a different subdivision based on pottery studies, probably a much more promising path using pottery than focusing on metal work only. And she divided the period in 5 stages and incorporated many finds from earlier excavations from the first half of the 20th century. However, she also used a quite confusing terminology, which sometimes, makes it hard to follow. The most recent chronological study of the Khojaly-Tepe is owed to Maria Pogrepova. She distinguished 5 phases. It's certainly so far the most comprehensive studies, without going into detail right now. So there has been quite some work done, but despite these efforts to structure the material culture of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age chronologically, I'm only talking about Western Azerbaijan, the lack of detailed documentation of archaeological raw material and of the objects themselves makes it difficult to evaluate the consistency of these proposals. There is, for example, no coherent typology or terminology. Publications of the entire archaeological finds are still rare, with most recent exceptions, as we will see. And there are no sufficiently accurate drawings and photographs and so on. So all these things that would allow to establish better and solid typological comparisons with freshly excavated material. So all in all, it is very difficult to build a sequence on typological means alone, effectively resulting in these long time ranges of several centuries for a single burial. And it is, until now, it is also almost impossible to delineate the duration of certain pottery shapes, or decorations, or wares through time. It is quite difficult to create relative sequences when you have to rely on burial sites only, and we have almost only burial sites that were then excavated and published quite some time apart and in many different ways. Another point that should be mentioned and will bring us back to Tepe 5 and two contemporaneous sites is that in all these attempts to sort the material culture, there is a strong tendency, sensible, to handle these cemeteries, no matter what size, as kind of a coherent and rather short-lived entity, and assign it to, as a whole, to only one of the proposed chronological stages. And so we are actually dealing with sequences of cemeteries and not of burials. And addressing this issue, radiocarbon dating of individual burials is probably very useful. At Tepe 5, we were able to retrieve 7 samples from the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and they do not only provide us with well-dated sets of artifacts, but they also made clear that even if Tepe 5 is obviously a small site, it was used as a burial ground almost throughout the entire late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, so that's quite some time. By the way, I forgot to mention these burials with a solid frame are the radiocarbon-dated. In particular, considering this with a later group of burials, which spread over several, this is really the same timeline, they spread over several of the proposed stages in these earlier systems of periodization, effectively contradicting the assumed chronological coherence of many cemeteries. I actually also wouldn't be surprised if we re-examine, for example, well-known cemeteries like in Mingajevir and take into consideration the individual burials that a much more fine-grained chronological development should be established. Now, all this is best exemplified by the small cemetery on Tepe 5, but also by 2 other contemporary cemeteries, namely Seyem Chai and Tovos Chai, both of which were excavated or detected during the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipelines. And in many aspects, Tepe 5 is nothing else than just a smaller version of these 2 sites. And they are also not that far away. They're located some 30 and 50 kilometers west of Tepe 5 and northwest of Tepe 5. Both cemeteries, Seyem Chai and Tovos Chai, were recently published, including a presentation of all the grave inventories, which I'm very grateful for. Most importantly, however, they also made radiocarbon samples of skeletons. In total, 5 burials at Seyem Chai and 6 burials at Tovos Chai were radiocarbon dated. And again, I just plotted all the results on the left side. We see from these results that also these 2 cemeteries covered a considerable amount of time and extended over more than one of the proposed subphases of this existing periodization. The time range proposed, for example, for the 130 burials at Seyem Chai lasts from the 14th century to the 10th or 9th century BC, and the earliest burials at Tovos Chai were dated slightly later to the 13th century BC, but the site continued to be used as a burial ground until the 9th century BC. We have some, I don't know exactly the number, I don't remember it, but it's also more than 100 burials were found in Tovos Chai. As I mentioned on the left side, you can see just an unmodeled chart of all the radiocarbon dates for the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age in Western Azerbaijan I could find so far and that I've compiled for this paper. The sequence consists mainly of the samples from Tepe 5, Seyem Chai and Tovos Chai. As you can see, there's some other sites, like two samples from Götepe and some other sites along the pipeline, though the latter ones, they don't have material with it published. It is not much yet, but it shows the continuous occupation of all these cemeteries and the potential for the chronological questions. And already in this raw form, some preliminary observations can be obtained. For example, the finds here as an example, in a burial excavated in Senjai make clear that for example churns appeared up to 200 centuries earlier than previously thought. Yeah. Just an example. If we would go deeper into this material, then we might find much more of these corrections to the existing system. I think it would, of course, be too far-reaching if we draw conclusions on the basis of these few radiocarbon dates or these radiocarbon dates from these few sites for the entire region of Western Azerbaijan or for a completely new system right now of periodization. It is too early for that, as we're dealing with more like a micro region in the Kura Valley. The sites are not that far apart. Things might have been completely different in the higher regions along the foothills of the Lesser Caucasus. I mean, to exaggerate a little right now, in the last 150 years, more than 1,000 burials were excavated there along the foothills, and it is still quite difficult to say more than this belongs to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, or this belongs to the Caucasus Tepe culture. It is, of course, also a major problem that research in the region is almost entirely based on funerary context. For example, also of the more than 100 Cyclopean structures that are known for this period in the Lesser Caucasus, only a fraction has been investigated, and even less contribute to chronological questions. Excavation of stratified settlements, which would be, of course, enormously important for us, are lacking, and they would improve our understanding of the chronology in the region and also provide us with a much wider insight into the material culture beyond the funerary context, which we're dealing right now solely. So there are many things to do, at least some of which I would like to approach in the future. And for now, I think the collected radiometric data is a good starting point. It is in particular a good starting point for further typological comparisons on ceramics, since we have now a well-dated sequence of assemblages, though only from burials, of course, that can be used as reference points for old and fresh archaeological material. But in the end, we certainly need to collect much more data to start also bridging the gap in research on absolute chronology in Western Azerbaijan compared to what has been done so far for the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age in Armenia and in Georgia. And with that, I'm at the end, and thank you very much.